Hello, I'm Alice Murray, editor of the Drawdown, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's panel discussion looking at cybersecurity as an ESG concern. This topic isn't entirely new. Certainly from the Drawdown's perspective, we started looking at this back in 2017. But what makes it so interesting today is that both cybersecurity and ESG have been thrown into sharp focus thanks to the events of the past 12 months. Cybersecurity is, of course, a matter of good governance, as well as reputation and risk management, putting it at the heart of ESG practices. However, cybersecurity has typically been viewed as solely an IT concern. It's hardly the first thing that springs to mind when you think of ESG. So during today's discussion, we will consider the ESG factors of good cybersecurity, looking at regulation and risk management. We'll also think about the LP and portfolio company points of view, and finally the how. But how cybersecurity can be an ESG concern via people, process, and systems. Please feel very welcome to ask questions throughout the discussion using the Q&A function at the bottom of your browser. And I'll do my best to weave those questions into the discussion, or we'll have some time towards the end if we don't get around to them. So with plenty to be discussing, I'll now hand over to the panelists to introduce themselves. Ahmed, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you. So I'm Ahmed. I am a data scientist. I'm a techie guy who happens to work in a private equity firm. I joined the membership last year, almost a year ago, exactly a year ago tomorrow. I focus on digital transformation. I focus on the use of data within the GP and with our portfolio companies. And of course, as we do that, then cybersecurity becomes more and more important to us, both operationally, but also from an ESG perspective.
Thank you very much. And Stefano, over to you.
Good afternoon to everybody, and nice to meet you, even remote. My name is Stefano Bacci. I am a partner and the ESG manager of Ambienta. Ambienta is a mid-market specialist in environmental sustainability, a GP. We invest in propositions that have a positive impact on the environment, pollution control, resource efficiency. We are very close to ESG because, as you understand, there is a clear overlap between our investment strategy and the capital E of ESG. We manage both private equity and public equity. In private equity, we raise 3 funds. We are pan-European. We invest out of 4 offices. We got London, where I am. We got Milan, Paris, and Munich in Germany. We are a mid-market player, so we are not a big player, 1.2 billion under management, companies that usually have 10 to 20 million EBITDA when we buy them. Very typically, we do primary deals. So we buy them directly from entrepreneurs, from founders, and we grow them. So that's our business model.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Stefano. And Jamie, over to you.
Good afternoon. So Jamie Smith, I'm the Director of International Technology at ECI, S-Cast Integration. We're a global managed service provider focused on the alternative investment sector. We have about 800 clients globally. My remit here is strategic advice to our clients, which covers cyber and infrastructure, digital transformation, lots of different IT projects. And my focus today will be on how we've seen ESG grow with our clients and what they ask us to partake in, be it in DDQs and vendor due diligence, questionnaires, etc., to give a little bit of an industry perspective on how we see the market.
Fantastic, thank you. So I'm sure you'll agree we've got a wonderfully qualified panel with us today who can give us the various angles and perspectives on this interesting topic. Okay, so in this first section of our discussion, we're going to think about regulation, risk and reputation. So as mentioned, cyber and ESG converge most keenly when it comes to risk and reputation management. So Ahmed, I'm going to start with you. What do you think is the best approach as a GP to those kind of converging factors of ESG and cyber?
I think the angles you propose, risk management and reputation management, are very important and easy way to actually probably get an introduction into this. So we as a GP, we are a regulated firm, and we have responsibilities to our LPs, we have responsibilities to the regulator, and we have responsibilities to our portfolio companies. I think as most financial services, I'm not sure whether this applies actually across the board for private equity, but definitely across financial services, you will find, and other industries, you will find very thorough risk analysis and risk mitigations around various different technology risks, and cybersecurity is one of them. Therefore, I think as we as a GP and our portfolio companies progress with digital transformations, changing the way we work, having a good base that assesses the risk, the cyber risk, that identifies the main sources of this risk, and have mitigating factors is very important. And to be honest, the regulation helps a lot, because when you look at certain FCA regulations, for instance, you will find a very detailed description of the areas to consider, and very detailed descriptions in terms of, for instance, contractual agreements with technology vendors, etc. That may be used as a mitigating factor, aside from the technology solutions that you may have on top. So we are forced by regulation to consider cybersecurity. Our duties to our LPs and our companies also forces us to do that. And I think trying to meet regulations and our, let's say, non-legal responsibilities, our intangible responsibilities, is something that we did early on in our digital transformation. We put together a digital policy document, which lists or describes several types of risks and threats, as well as our policy to mitigate them, either through ways we contract, through ways we work, through technologies we use, or through incident management.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so a lot of what you're talking about there, includes the way in which you're working with third parties. So naturally, Jamie, I think you're going to be able to kind of touch on that, and what's your, how do you see this side of things?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I agree with Ahmed there. I think creating the kind of policies that you, not policies, but the strategy around how you're going to do business and how you're going to take care of certain regulatory demands that do govern how you do business, and make them formalize those policies. I think when you're working with third parties, SaaS providers, obviously now the kind of world's moving into that arena. Having a strong vendor due diligence process is important. Really kind of making sure there's some non-negotiables in there of how you use that third party. Things like identity management. Can you bring in a single source of truth to who's accessing your data? And again, that comes from where your data is. If you're going to use a third party, how are they storing your data? Are they storing it in a way that you would expect them to? And the only way to find out is to ask. You can't take that for granted, because going back to the regulations, that's on you. The risk and reputation risk there is on you as the company. So you need to make sure that you have that formalized, and there is a formal due diligence process that really gets into those questions. The identification there is key for me, identifying where your data is, how it's being stored, how it's being protected, looking at those high risks. And if there's a firm that isn't doing it quite the way you expect or would desire, have you got a mitigation for that? Is there a way that you can lessen the risk on your business if that was to come to harm? Because the reputational risk, and that's the real big concern at the moment, the reputational risk of having a cyber attack or a breach is a primary concern now for most PE managers. I think LPs want to invest in firms that have a proven track record, and that goes as far as their reputation now, with things like cyber and any kind of breaches or incidents that have occurred. If that confidence drops, then there's a lot of firms out there at the moment that people can invest in. There's lots of competition in the marketplace, so the reputation is something you can't get back once it's gone, and it comes from making sure that you're doing things in the right way. And that's on the GP to make sure that they are choosing the right vendors and the right providers to help them, or going alone. If you don't trust other people as much as you trust yourself, you can build it yourself and do what you need to do in-house as well, which a lot of people do still.
Super. Okay, thank you. And Stefano, obviously you're very much with an ESG hat. How much does cyber feature as one of your kind of risk factors, or in terms of reputation for you?
I think that cyber is certainly a risk factor, and is a risk factor that is growing in importance. And I think that especially now, all what we experience with COVID has changed the way we work, has made it more remote in general in many aspects of our life. And so cybersecurity, I think, will play an important role, a growing role going forward. From our perspective, many of our investments are in industrial operations. So cybersecurity is clearly an issue, but is not the issue. There's many other issues. I mean, a reputational risk could be an intrusion in your IT systems of some sort and a data leakage, but another risk could be simply a leakage of chlorine in the air in one of your factories that stir up clearly a response at local level. So we do have a wider reputational risk policy. We always, as a small GP, prefer action to compliance. Nothing against compliance. We are absolutely compliant into all aspects where we can, but we always, with our limited resources, privilege action. So we also have not only a policy of risk management, but we also have certain tools for managing risk that go from simple communication guidelines to more, if you want, little but important things. For example, for whatever portfolio company we own in whatever country, we get directly, the partners in charge for the deal get the press clippings of the company. So for any company of which, for example, I'm on the board, I don't need the management to tell me if something has happened, because I can read it in the press in parallel. And that is very powerful, because from a management perspective, there will always be a protective attitude to, towards whatever possibly happened to their firms and to their operations. So a policy needs to have clear communication guidelines, because you need to know before there is an issue. A policy needs to have preventative action, and in our approach to ESG, we insist a lot on preventative actions, because not only is it important to know before there is a problem, but it's even more important to avoid there being a problem to start with. So preventative action, communication, and then monitoring tools in parallel.
Fantastic. That's very interesting. Yeah. Okay. So kind of, I think that's such an interesting element of ESG, is kind of where you're collecting your data from, and increasingly what I'm coming across is needing that external data source. So it's not just being derived internally from the portfolio companies, but there's an external data feed, and so press cuttings is a way that you're able to do that, which is very interesting. Super. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so kind of moving on to thinking more carefully about governance. Obviously, when it comes to governance, as the GPs on the panel know, you've got kind of several hats that you need to wear. Governance on behalf of your LPs, so when they're doing their operational due diligence, and when you need to report to them on ESG and obviously cyber matters, and then privacy governance down the chain towards your portfolio companies. Ahmed, I'm going to come to you in your almost 12 months at Stirling Square. How much have you kind of been involved with in terms of communicating to your investors around cybersecurity? So I'm thinking specifically on the ESG questionnaires, whether it's coming up at board meetings. Is there any kind of regular reporting on this?
There is different aspects to this, I think. I think there is the easiest one that we can describe is the regular questionnaires, the regular communication, exchange of data, either between us and the portfolio companies or between us and LPs. I think most of the participants in private equity would agree that the questionnaires getting longer and longer. They are getting more and more detailed, and they are getting more and more into areas where you can't actually decide, is this an area for management, is this an area for an investor, is this an area for the investor, or is an area for AP? So the boundaries are being blurred, and I think it's a good thing, because I think it's a value chain. We all sit across a value chain, and if one element of that value chain falls, it affects everybody. So I think the fact that the regular questionnaires that we either ask our companies to respond to, or the ones we have to respond to, the fact that they get more details, longer, etc., is not necessarily a bad thing. That's one element. The second element is deal making. I think we, especially in tech, we are very similar to Ambienta and what Stefano was describing. We focus on B2B. Historically, we have focused on industrial assets, etc. But we see that, at least in the last 12 months where I've been with Stirling Square, is that most of the leads we are getting more and more biased towards asset-light, tech-enabled B2B businesses. And that in itself brings a whole new level of risks and requires a whole new set of expertise. So it's not just what we report on, but also what we diligence and what we consider when we look at deals. And the final element of this is obviously communication and cross-fertilization between organizations, especially within our portfolio companies, outward communication, what we communicate in our AGM to LPs, etc. Again, it's being more and more ESG, the content ESG is becoming more and more important. The anecdotal evidence we provide is becoming more and more important part of the pitches we make. And the involvement of our companies, our portfolio companies, and really thinking about ESG in general, but also cybersecurity, not in terms of reporting, but in terms of real content, again, is becoming more and more important. We see it, we have many organizations in our portfolio that I think both the environmental, the ESG in general is potentially a value creator. Some of them are already in that. We have a few companies in the recycling and the circular economy, etc. And I think their pitch and their raison d'etre, if you like, is becoming clearer and clearer to the wider society and wider investor community. Other organizations, they're still not there, but we can think about how we create value out of ESG, and we don't report for report's sake. We actually open communication and brainstorm both the risk but also the opportunities. I see it, these things, I think they are getting or at least the communications around them and the action lists we have on ESG in general, but our cybersecurity is getting more and more sophisticated, both from what we are asked to do or report on and what we ask our organizations to report on.
Fantastic. Thank you. Lots of really interesting points there. And certainly something I want to come back to on the kind of ESG as a value creator, and maybe how ESG can, how cyber can fit into that. But Stefano, I'm keen to come over to you, just kind of in response to Ahmed's comments there, thinking about kind of communications between yourself and your investors, and also with your portfolio companies. And also I wonder if, given you've got the kind of listed entity, does that push for more reporting and more communication?
I would say, first of all, we don't have a dedicated communication line on cybersecurity. I have to say, most of the questions in cybersecurity that we got is in fundraising and within, as part of an ODD package. On the broader ESG, instead we communicate a lot, because as I said at the beginning, we are quite active on ESG. We believe that it creates value. We are absolutely convinced it's got an enormous overlap with our investment thesis. And we created a program that we call internally ESG in Action, that we apply on 100% of our portfolio companies. And eventually, since a couple of years, we also applied on ourselves, the GP, which in my head was second priority, but investors really wanted us to do that, so we did it. Second priority because we are, a GP, so we are less than 100, while in portfolio companies there is thousands of people, and there is way more scope for results than there is on the GP itself. For us, as I said, is important. So when we look at portfolio companies, we usually discuss the ESG agenda on a monthly basis. Usually the first or one of the first 4 or 5 slides of any board package of companies we manage have the ESG cockpit. Now, where does this come from? I mean, as part of the ESG in Action program that I mentioned, we do a number of steps. It's broken down in 7 steps. Now, I will not tell you the old steps, but somehow one of the steps is the formation of an ESG action plan at a certain moment of the life of an investment. And the ESG action plan is board approved by the board of the company. And then the action plan contains a number of activities and a number of KPIs and a number of responsibles that need to make sure that those KPIs go in a certain direction. So every month, this is discussed in the board of the portfolio company. And every quarter, we have a portfolio quarterly review meeting internally with the whole firm. And again, we have every company is condensed down in 5, 6 pages and mainly financial. But one of the 5, 6 pages is ESG progress. So the entire firm reviews, discusses the ESG progress of each one of our portfolio companies. And that is very important, not only because it helps to the bottlenecks when there are some, but also it creates a lot of culture within the firm. So internally, monthly with the company and quarterly internally in the GP. With investors, we communicate quarterly. All our quarterly reports include an ESG update section. And then we publish a more comprehensive report that we call Integrated ESG and Sustainability once a year, which is very much appreciated by investors. That doesn't decrease, though, the thirst that investors have for data. So Ahmed mentioned questionnaires. Yes, despite all this communication, we still receive plenty of questionnaires. Questionnaires are a bit of an issue because there are many, they get longer, and they require senior time. I mean, many of the questions are actually quite tricky. So you can't take the most junior in the organization and say, oh, please, fill in these 200 pages. In our firm, it's a partner job, and it takes a lot of time. But I think it's a necessary evil. I don't think that this proliferation of questionnaires will continue forever. I think the industry needs to develop a language, as it has developed a language in accounting, in financials, right? In ESG, not yet. ESG is incredibly wide. It goes from cybersecurity to other elements, social governance, environment is incredibly wide. So to find a common language, to talk to each other, LPs and GPs and portfolio companies, and to report information down and up, because LPs have certain vision of the world, which we as GP have a fiduciary duty to implement at portfolio level. Portfolio companies need to report about their progress, and we, again, in the middle, have a fiduciary duty to bring it up to our LPs, because it's theirs, the money that we invest, right? So I think there will be eventually a common language that will make reporting easier. Cybersecurity, I'm sure it will be part of this flow. The importance can only grow, because digitalization makes the problem more actual and more urgent and more pervasive.
Yes, yeah. And I suppose there are attempts happening with the European Commission level on a taxonomy around ESG. But I guess even in the past few months, the amount of movement already on the RTS shows just how tricky it is to create this common language. And certainly having looked purely at the financial side of creating a taxonomy itself and how hard that is to do one for anything non-financial, I would happily step away from that. It's not my responsibility. Okay, so Jamie, coming to you and thinking about kind of when you're working with private equity firms, I understand that you get a lot more involved now with their portfolio companies on these sorts of matters. Yeah. So kind of, what's your take on how you see the GPs acting and working with their portfolio companies in this arena?
Yeah, I think they take a lot more of an interest at the moment, because it is a kind of heightened sense, and cybersecurity is very important. I think it depends on how many portfolio companies there are, but there could be quite a few in the chain, and they'll all be at different levels and have different needs and have different budgets and different processes for these things. And it's important, I guess, if you're going to manage these investments, that you have a common set of reporting that you need them to kind of feed into. And so we are finding that we do bring some assistance to our private equity firms and help them with those portcos and the management of those portcos. Sometimes it's creating a deal room or a reporting room for them to upload the data into. Other times it's really going in and helping them with the DDQ process with questions they should be asking. And then even a step further, if there's kind of more need, going in, helping them with some actual work, so to speak, with those portfolio companies. I think with the heightened, risks and stuff that are there with reputation, with a portco that you're holding and problems that occur, it's easier at that level to prescribe how they should do it than let them take their own initiative in certain ways, because the benefit of managing multiple companies is that you have what works for one may well work for the other companies too. And so it's definitely more commonplace now to see that and to spread out how prescriptive they are with the companies, and we're certainly seeing that is taking a lot more interest. In terms of how they manage those companies with things like breaches and stuff, and how they report back any issues, we're definitely seeing a lot more, again, prescription, how they do that and getting more involved with it. And before they even take a portco on, maybe bringing in one of the big auditing firms to do a full-blown cyber risk assessment on that before they get involved with the deal. So it's definitely becoming more commonplace to get more active and do more. And we do see some private equity firms really making that more of a community as well, and getting the heads of operations, the heads of IT, kind of talking together and forming a kind of more a community-based approach to it, which is using your strengths, I guess, and making sure that the people are talking and working together almost, which is good to see.
So a question's come through, which, I'm on the same wavelength. So I guess, I'll open this up to the whole panel. Has anyone seen an investment delayed or cancelled due to the cybersecurity risks posed by a potential acquisition?
Yes, I have, yeah.
Oh.
No, specifically, it's again, a tech-enabled business. They chose a strategy to stress test their infrastructure from a cybersecurity perspective that we didn't agree with, which therefore we asked for further steps before we can make a final decision.
Yeah. Great, that's so interesting, and I think, yeah, when we were talking about that point there, I'm writing about valuations at the moment, and so I've been thinking about the importance of trying to include ESG factors into a financial valuation, and obviously a lot of people talk about, you know, if a company, particularly when it comes to exit, if a company hasn't thought about its ESG credentials, it's going to be difficult to sell that company. It's not thought about its long-term risks. And so on this kind of similar line, if a company hasn't properly embedded ESG policies, practices and behaviours, could that dent a company's value? Or be a negotiation point, maybe.
Yeah, I can take this. I think ESG creates value, and I think if I think about my personal experience, I think especially G, if it's well managed, creates a lot of value. It doesn't deliver EBITDA, G, but it delivers multiple. When you sell a company which is impeccably managed because it's got a governance structure, where the governance structure is not only a hierarchical structure, but is also a data structure, information management structure. When you sell a company that has its growth under full control and visibility, it has a different value. I mean, personally, in our portfolio, we have companies where in 2-3 years, we have about doubled the multiple. So we sold for twice the multiple we bought, simply because we see major governance issues these companies had.
I'm hesitating because I think it's a matter of semantics, I think, because private equity have always looked into governance structures and unlocking values out of them, especially in primary deals. The real question is, what does the G encompass? I think 100% of GPs will know that it's shareholder agreements and company structure, et cetera, but financial controls and so on. But I wouldn't say that 100% would agree that that includes data security, or that includes general network security, or that includes the way you do IAM to manage access to your systems, right? That's why I'm hesitating. I think G is a key lever for private equity. Is just what does it include in terms of considerations. I think that's my question. Probably back to Stefano. I don't have necessarily.
Thanks for calling me in on this. I'm not a data scientist. I think G includes a lot, and I think you mentioned most of what is included and most of what is probably excluded, because maybe network security is not part of G. Actually, I think it should be part of G. Now, how important is it going to be in terms of price recognition at exit? It has multiple. I think it depends on how much the business model of that particular company relies on that element in order to unfold properly, rather than not. I mean, I can think companies where certain elements of what you said play a minor importance, and other in companies where this plays a much bigger importance. So I think there it gets trickier. I mean, you need to see what that company needs in order to work properly. But I think that ESG creates a lot of value. I think governance in particular, social probably creates more stability than value. Now I'm generalizing, so I run the risk of being called off brutally wrong by anyone in the audience. But usually S is more about stability of the workforce. You use labor, and you need to make sure that you return enough for there to be an equilibrium between what resources you draw and what you give back. and it's not only salary, it's not only equality, it's certainly salary equality, but it's also training, it's also other elements of support that anybody that works needs. Environment is disruptive. If you mismanage, you may end up having to shut down your operations because you hit a concrete wall at a certain moment in doing things that are not sustainable, they're not allowed, they're not practices you can continue. Governance is the one that is more, I think, value accretive of the three.
But perhaps there's an argument to both your points in that as digitalization becomes a fact of life, there's very few sectors now, very few companies that can completely eschew digitization. It's, we couldn't have existed this past year if there wasn't a digital element to everything that we're doing. And so through that digitization then immediately means that cyber and data management falls under the governance remit.
I agree. I think it increases. I think the digitalization is about fundamental changes to how you do business, not necessarily doing things on computers as opposed to we know, for instance, that computers didn't increase productivity, right? So I think it's about business models and how you do things. And I think, again, going back to certain types of dominant type of companies in our portfolio, which are industrials, etc., digitalization means breaking what used to be a very clear Chinese wall between what's called operational technology and information technology. So if you look at industrial organizations taking the IoT route for yield maximization, for predictive maintenance, etc., that necessarily means the blurring of that Chinese wall. So traditionally, operational technology, for instance, is the technology or the, let's call them computers that help you run a refinery, for instance, right? Typically, they are completely dissociated from your information technology, which helps you communicate to the world, which helps you have email and pay invoices and pay salaries, etc. So the operational technology side is segregated, and it's harder to penetrate because there are very few links between it and the IT, information technology, which is generally connected to external systems. In 2021, that means the internet. But then if you have IoT, which is Internet of Things, which is sensors sending stuff back onto the internet, then by definition, you're breaking that Chinese wall. So that brings new types of threats that you have to be very cognizant of, and you have to be ready to mitigate and manage. So digitalization, yes, it increases risk, but also I think if you do it at a fundamental level to the way you do business, that may bring you risks that weren't there at all, or you thought that you had them managed by design, like OT-IT separation.
Super. Thank you. Agreeing with my point. Okay, so this leads us on very nicely to the final part of this discussion, of kind of thinking about the how of how all of this works. And clearly what we're hitting on here is that a lot of the reason behind this discussion is that there's been a big shift in thinking around ESG, and also I think the threat level of ESG has been present since we've had internet, but clearly the attacks now are so sophisticated, and particularly private equity is a major target. So against this shift, probably we're not seeing yet the reflection in human capital or team organization. So Jamie, I'm going to come to you because I think you'll have quite an interesting perspective here. You talked about you're obviously working with GPs on their own systems and increasingly involved with their portfolio companies on their cyber controls. Who is it that you're working with in both of these remits? Are you working with the kind of operational leaders within the GP? Are you working with investment professionals, tech professionals, ESG? Who's your kind of normal port of call?
We see a lot of it being outsourced, to be honest. A lot of it does go out to third parties and engage a lot with third parties. When it's like the RFP process, so when we're kind of doing, our first touch with the potential client, there's a lot which is covered off there through a kind of DDQ process and through an RFP process. And then another point, when a client has a big ticket investment or maybe has a new LP coming on, there could be then another set of questions that we need to go through. The guy said earlier about how much and how lengthy those questionnaires are now. It's the same for us as a service provider. They're not small documents that you can just have a salesperson do. They get really into the inner workings of the company and how we do certain things. It helps for us to have certifications that we can call out sections on, and that does give us some kudos, and it does give an element of safety to the third party doing the questionnaires. But you can have your SOC 2s and you can have your ISOs. It doesn't mean that you're safe. And I think that it's really important they go into the other areas. I'll let the guys kind of come in a second, but the last bit for me that we're seeing the change in the DDQ format and what's included is there's a lot more now on the social and economic side and environmental side, which is to do with things like our employee welfare, like what benefits do we give our employees, the Modern Slavery Act, things like that, working hours, holidays, all those things that we just really kind of throw away, you wouldn't really consider. It's important now that we keep our staff happy, that we keep our business kind of social and everything else. So there are a lot more questions within there that relate into everything other than the technology and how we manage our clients' infrastructure, which was a bit surprising at first. But if I think about what we actually do at ECI for our employees, our head of people is very kind of good at bringing on all of the things that you'd expect for employee welfare. Throughout COVID, for example, we've done tons to make sure our employees are safe and safeguarded, and mental health, just everything you'd expect from an employer. And I don't think that's because of ESG reporting. It's because we try to be a thoughtful company, I guess, but definitely that's being called out within them. And our policies with regards to our employees are becoming just as important as our technology.
Great, I'll come work for you. Okay, so Ahmed, I'm going to come to you and just kind of to respond to some of Jamie's comments there. When you're working with third parties, are you applying a similar kind of ESG lens to the providers that you work with? Are you asking them about the kind of mental well-being of their staff?
I think yes. I think that is obviously a very important part. To be honest, I prefer working with vendors I worked with before, and I know the people are happy. And I know, so I think it's a very human thing, right? It's that the team is happy. So it's important. I think when it comes to things like certifications, they are necessary but insufficient conditions. And this covers everything. Every company that was a victim to a cyber attack had certifications. And every company that had an accounting scandal was audited. Almost every. So I think these are necessary but insufficient conditions. So I think it doesn't take away the responsibility to actually assume what happens if the worst happens. So what do I need to put in place in case the worst happens? I think that's very different when to dealing with the people, right? So with the employee welfare strategies, because you don't want to be in the worst possible situation, or environmental issues. I think that's where you really need to be to have a zero risk policy. Other than that, as I said, it's important to do the due diligence. It's important to onboard our partners properly when they come start working with us. It's important that you are very clear about expectations. For myself, for instance, in certain situations in certain projects that we're working on around digitalizations, I refuse to deal with email attachments. Right? Don't send me an email. If I get the email attachments, I answer. I say we agreed no attachments. Right? And that's just to create the habit of new habits so that we reduce the risk. If you send me a Word document today with an attachment, you may send me an encryption key as an attachment, right? So no attachment means don't do that for the small things and for the big things, so that it's important to have that habit around the really important things, like, I don't know, encryption keys, secret passwords, things like that, right? So it's about, as I said, certification, due diligence, onboarding, explaining the expectations, and trying to build habits within the team, especially with third-party personnel who deal with many different companies. It's probably not easy for them to have consistency in behavior just working with me.
I'm sorry for sending you so many attachments. Okay, so okay, so lovely points there, and yes, definitely. Another point, you know, where ESG and cyber really join is around, you know, it's one thing to have a policy, but this is about behaviors and actions. So we're nearing the end of our time here. So Stefano, I'm going to come to you for our last question. How does Ambienta go about kind of making any kind of behavioral change, kind of, you know, as an ESG focused investor? I guess that is so much part of your remit. So what are the key things you can do in terms of changing behaviors? Oh, sorry, you're on mute.
You're on mute.
Yeah.
Sorry, you mean internally in Ambienta, or you mean from our observation point, looking at portfolio companies?
I think, yeah, both, whichever feels more.
I mean, I think probably the most difficult element to manage of ESG is accountability. I mean, I was having a call this morning with an industry organization that is working at, for example, how to gather ESG KPIs, aggregate and send them back in form of reports to LPs, but also beyond LPs, to the wider community of the stakeholders. And and you know, there is always the temptation as a GP to say, oh, it's so much work, this reporting, that I probably should delegate a service provider to manage this on my behalf. And probably they would do a better job. And certainly they would do a better job. But then you would waive your own accountability as a GP for really steering a transformation, which instead we took very seriously. So internally, ESG now is in all our internal performance KPIs. As a partner of the firm, as a senior partner of the firm, ESG is one of my 4 or 5 elements that determines my bonus at the end of the year. And the same is for the entire investment team. So we have a KPI for performance that we call ESG Drive, that depends on how portfolio companies have progressed against their ESG action plan. And that is part of the determination of the bonus and career evolution. If I instead look at externally, I think that is, as I was saying, is a world that is changing fast and is becoming more and more important. And accountability, I think, again, externally remains the trick. Demand for cybersecurity, I think, is exploding. We bought a company called Namirial recently, a few months ago, that sells product for digital transaction management. So how to do a transaction secure. So in that way, cybersecurity without proximity. In the old world, the most secure way to execute a transaction, like the conveyance of a house, is, well, in person, in front of maybe a notary, we both show up and sign. Nowadays, this is impossible. We work remotely, not only on transactions, but on education, on collaborative tools and collaboration. I think proximity as an element of security going forward is probably lost, and digital transaction management grows organic, the market at 30% per annum. So that witnesses the fact that there is an enormous demand in the market.
Super. Okay. I've got a final question from the audience, which I'm going to quickly ask, and then we'll wrap things up. And it's very relevant to what you've just both been talking about. So it's what are some of the KPIs you look at when you're tracking cybersecurity? I think you're all very qualified to answer. Jamie, I'm going to start with you. What's a key cybersecurity KPI?
I think things like vulnerability assessments so I think you would have a strategy around your cyber, which would include like annual testing, breaches, like incidents, things like that, incidents reported. So I would say having those vulnerability assessments and what comes up in those, how many high risk and low moderate risk, etc. And also how many incidents you have reported in the previous 12 months are two that we kind of see a lot.
Yeah, and as I think as we've kind of talked about throughout this panel, obviously, as much as ESG is so highly unique to each portfolio company, then naturally its cyber risks will be as well. Ahmed, like you discussed with the industrial company, that's going to have very specific KPIs, right?
Yes. But in general, what you are trying to do is make sure that you identify your vulnerabilities and you're tackling them. So exactly what Jamie said, that you are stress testing your ecosystem in general, penetration testing, etc. So there are various techniques that you need to do to test, and then thirdly, that certain behaviors and policies are being implemented, right? So one that springs to mind immediately is identity and access management, application of the rule of least privilege, etc., etc. So these things that can be measured and should be measured, and compliance with them are important.
Fab. Okay, well, Stefano, unless you've got anything to add around specific KPIs?
Nope.
I think we've covered it nicely. Great, okay, well, I would say that's going to do us for today. So first of all, thank you massively to my wonderful panel. Lots of interesting things discussed as build, lots of points. If you want to watch this again, which I'm sure you do, we'll be posting it on our website, and we'll make sure that that gets shared around. So thank you so much, and huge thanks also to the audience for watching and taking part. And yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.